Good afternoon and welcome to Who's Right. We're so happy to have Congressman Ripple here with us today. It's Reid Ribble from Wisconsin. And Reid, how do you do?
Oh, nice to meet you,
Nice
Sandra.
to
Thank
meet you, and so happy that you're here. I wanted to ask you, you started out as a businessman.
Right.
What business were you in?
I owned a commercial roofing company in Kaukauna, Wisconsin.
How long did you own that
Well,
company?
I bought it from my father in 1980. And I started working there shortly after school, and then took it over in the early 1980s. So almost 35 years.
35 years
Yeah.
in a roofing company.
Yeah.
And what made you decide to run for Congress?
Well, it's I think a combination of frustration. I saw a lot of intrusion of the government into the business world that frustrated me. In 2008, after the global financial crisis and meltdown, President Barack Obama came into office as the president. The U.S. Senate and U.S. House went to the Democrats.
Right.
And I was frustrated. And my oldest son lives in Nashville, Tennessee. I've got 2 grandchildren there.
Yes.
He and his wife. And I was complaining to him, maybe a little more vocally and vociferously than normal. And finally he just said, "Dad, stop. You always told me if I didn't like my circumstance in life, I ought to go change it. And so if you don't like the circumstance, you ought to go change it. Otherwise, in a year from now, you'll come back here, we'll have another Christmas, and we'll have the same conversation over again." And that's what started the seed to get me thinking about
Is that right?
Yeah.
And so you just said, you know what? I'm one of those people that I'm just going to be the person that stands up and does something about it.
Yeah, I was cynical enough about how government operates. I was
Right.
cynical about the whole political process. I thought, you know what, I really don't trust anybody else to do this, so I'm going to offer myself up, and if the people like what they hear, they'll make a decision and I'll end up in Congress. If not, maybe I could have shaped the debate and, more importantly, shaped the tone of the debate, because the tone has gotten so vitriolic, it's unproductive.
Right.
And so I thought maybe I could even do that, and maybe that's what I was kind of called to accomplish. But here I am, a member of the United States House of Representatives.
Isn't that something? So you just went out and started your campaign on your own?
I did.
You did?
Having never run, listen, I've never even been class president before. And so, but I made a decision along with my wife that if someone looked me in the eye and asked me a question, just like you're doing now, that I'll look them in the eye and give them the answer back. I'm not going to consider the politics of the moment. I'm just going to consider the truth. And people were looking, I think, more than anything, at least I knew what I looked for in a candidate. I looked for someone who was genuine, who was sincere, and had their feet planted in what they believed. And I felt I was that way, and so I ran my campaign that way.
That's fantastic. So did it take you very long to get a campaign staff together? And
it did. I filed my papers July 4th, 2009. I made my first hire in October. And that person was just really an administrative assistant, kind of a personal assistant to help me manage my schedule. And then ultimately in November, I hired a campaign manager. I did contract with a consultant to kind of direct the campaign and put the overall arching strategy together. But then through the course of the next year, we added staff and volunteers. And
you made commercials and you did the whole thing.
But you know, the commercial side was the easy side. The marketing side for this whole thing, that really wasn't difficult for me, because in my business we were doing television commercials for 20 years. And so that was simple.
That was the easy side is right. Yeah. What it was going out and getting those votes.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have, I had some name recognition. I mean, I was the varsity volleyball coach at Appleton East High School for 20 years. I'm a 3rd generation Wisconsin resident, born and raised up there.
Yes.
So I lived in that area of the state my entire life, and I ran a fairly successful business. I served on corporate boards and things like that. So some people knew
you were
me.
a member, a stalwart member of the community. Yes. And so that helped a lot.
Right. I didn't start from ground zero.
Yes, exactly. Well, that is wonderful. What a great American story.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because it almost coalesced at about the same time the Tea Party movement was happening. And I would listen to the Tea Party speeches and the different groups. I was never really what I would consider a Tea Party candidate. But when they talked about the ideal candidate, they described me. Someone who came up, who wasn't a career politician, who decided just as a regular U.S. citizen to take the reins or the mantle of this job, and I did, and the people responded.
That's fantastic. Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
I'm so happy to have you as a member of the Congress.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
So what is it like to be be a public servant now?
It is the most intriguing, but also rewarding. I'm really humbled by it. That first moment when you walk in, you know, everybody has a perception of what government is, but when you walk into that House chamber that first time, there's a weight that's put on you. I realized when I put that voting card into that machine, I'm speaking for 700,000 Americans back in my home district.
Yeah.
And it's important for me to speak for them. You know, it's less important, and I know I'm here at the Republican convention, but it's less important for me to speak for the Republican Party than it is for me to speak to the people, speak for the people that sent me. And that's the weight that is on you, the responsibility that you bear, and you do it to the best of your ability.
Yeah, that is so true. I mean, I would have that on my conscience all the time if it were me.
It weighs on you because those folks are relying on you to do what's right, and to do basically what you said you would do during your campaign.
Right. Now, what committees are you serving on?
Well, originally I was assigned to work with Paul Ryan on the Budget Committee, and I'm on the Budget Committee, and I was also assigned Agriculture, which really fit the district well. The Agriculture committee assignment was important to me because my district is so rural, and agriculture is such a large piece of it. And then the budget fit me like a glove. As a business owner, getting my arms quickly around numbers. I'm a bit of a numbers guy, and so I was intrigued by that whole thing. And so those were the first two committees. After the budget was done, the Speaker Boehner asked if I would be willing to serve on transportation and infrastructure as well. I'm one of a handful of freshmen that were given 3 committees, and so I'm also on transportation and infrastructure.
So on transportation, that's a big issue with Obama. He wants to see electric cars take over the country. How do you feel about that?
I think what the president ought to worry about is whether we have bridges that are safe to drive on, whether our waterways are functioning correctly, and whether our manufacturers have the ability to make products and easily move them about the world in a way that's cost efficient and puts them at the best possible advantage to compete in a world environment. We have a tendency to think that all of our customers live here in the United States, but 95% of a manufacturer's potential client base lives outside the United States.
95%?
95%. And so we need to stay focused on the fact that our manufacturing community, if we want to create good, high-paying jobs here in Wisconsin, and for me especially in Northeast Wisconsin, we need to have the infrastructure in place that we can move those products anywhere in the world quickly, whether it's through moving about this continent on rail, whether we're using air traffic, whether we're using the Great Lakes shipping lanes to get into the ocean, or whether we're using trucking.
Interesting. So your feeling on electric cars is?
Well, you know, I think the market should decide whether an electric car is a good idea or a bad idea. You know, if the major manufacturers of automobiles invent and make an electric car, and the consumer wants to pay for it at the price they want to sell it, more power to them. I don't think the government should be in there stimulating it one way or the other.
I see. So tell me what your ideas are for seeing some real spending cuts take place.
We're spending too much money.
We're spending too much money.
We really are. And working on the Budget Committee helped really help me to look inside the government and to see where all this money was going. And as a business guy, I look through life through the lens of a business owner because my entire professional experience has been shaded by that lens. And so initially I wanted to see what were the cost drivers. You know, granted we could attack things like foreign aid, but it's such a small piece of it, you don't make a lot of headway. And what I discovered as I began to dig into the numbers, there are really just a handful of drivers that are the big pieces. One is defense spending, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the national debt. Those are the big drivers of where the money is going. And so if we're willing to take a look seriously at those and seeing how we can reform them, not to minimize them, not to reduce them, but to protect and secure them, we can get our arms around it.
Right. Well, defense is a big one, and of course it's necessary. So how
It
do you
is.
cut spending in defense?
Well, it is big and it is necessary, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. It
No.
doesn't mean that it's without waste. It doesn't mean that it
Right,
hasn't
right.
bloated. A prime example, the House of Representatives decided not to have two different engines available for the new strike fighter airplane. That saved $135 billion over the lifetime of that aircraft. And we start to look at those things. Secretary Gates came and talked to us and said, you know, I think we can shave $70 billion over the next decade off of defense spending by doing certain things that will help make the military more efficient, leaner, have our aircraft and our naval vessels operate in a more efficient, cost-effective manner. Redeployment of troops from safe harbor nations to different places in the world. There's a lot of things that could be done, and the idea that there's no waste in the military, well, that's not true either. And so what we did
No,
is
of course not.
we consulted with military experts, and we found a way to begin reducing the rate of growth in defense spending.
I see. Because when I hear cutting defense, I get worried. Because
Sure.
we're at war, we're at two wars, and we're on the brink of disaster over in Israel. I mean, I just, you know, get very fearful because
Sure.
we must be strong.
Yeah, and there's no
We
one
must
on,
be the strongest
sure,
nation.
there's no one on the Republican side saying that we shouldn't be. But what we're saying is, how can we, like every other aspect of government, how can we help provide the disciplines necessary so that we don't have wasteful spending? And that's really where you had to talk, and that's why I mentioned a dual engine for a jet fighter. Maybe that wasn't the best use of it.
Is it because that for so long we have just given out these contracts that have just had such big holes in them?
I don't necessarily know that that's the case as it is. You know, I mean, to develop a new ship like we're building up in Marinette, a new naval vessel, well, there's a lot of research and development and engineering that goes into that at the front end. And a lot of these defense contractors, I've got a couple in northeast Wisconsin with Oshkosh Truck and Marinette Marine. These folks spend hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars in development and to make sure that our Navy and Army are the best in the world. And so there's that type of expense, but that's often borne not just by the taxpayer, but also by those corporations that are seeking to get those contracts.
Sure.
On the other side of it, Department of Defense contracting, the idea of entering into some type of contract with the Department of Defense is costly and time-consuming for businesses. And so
Why is that?
Well, they've got contracts that are literally hundreds of pages long, and the purchasing process is more cumbersome than it needs to be, and sometimes can box out smaller entrepreneurial organizations. And another one of those things where some cost savings could be achieved if we could streamline that a bit. And so, but it's a matter of finding a way to streamline it where you don't interject fraud into the system. And you know, like a lot of things the government does, if a little bit is good, a lot is better, and so they start to put contractual responsibilities and restrictions in until the contracts are so restrictive that the cost balloons. And so we have to find a more sweet spot for some of our defense contractors.
It's a bad habit that's hard to break.
It is, like a lot in government.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, what do you think on the debt ceiling? Do you think that we can secure the increase in the debt ceiling?
Do I think we can secure the increase? Sure, I think it can be done, but here's my take on the debt ceiling. Our country has been spending money, almost, I liken it this way. It's like having my teenage son with my credit card, and they run the credit card up. Now the reality is I'm still going to be responsible for paying that bill, but I might not be such a good parent if I leave that credit card in the child's hands.
Right.
And so my approach on this is, if the debt ceiling is going to be moved up, it must be moved up with very strict requirements on how the government going forward can spend. And I wonder sometimes to myself, and I'm going to wonder out loud to you, whether or not we're better off to say no on increasing the debt ceiling and forcing the country to deal with the problem now. Because a $14 trillion problem is massive, but a $21 trillion problem could be devastating. And at some point, we are going to deal with it, right? The pain of overspending is going to catch up to all of us.
We'll have to.
And so I think we have to be very, very strict on any type of movement on the debt ceiling.
That's interesting. I've heard that opinion more than once today.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah. That's
well, we got the message. I mean, the voters have told us that they want the government to begin to live within its means.
Yeah. Are there cabinet departments or agencies that we can do without, that we can cut down on, get away?
Sure.
What are they?
Yeah, you know, I think that the American people need to begin to have a grown-up, adult-like conversation about what are the best ways. And I'm gonna use education as an example, because anybody who's got a child or a nephew or a niece, even if you don't have your own children, you know children, and you want to make sure and you want to secure that they have the best education. But the idea that a taxpayer in my district in Appleton, Wisconsin, should send $100 to Washington, D.C. in the form of taxes, whereby they take out 35 or 40 or 45 cents to pay the lights and the infrastructure and the personnel and Department of Education, with which to send 60 cents back to Madison, and then Madison takes another 20 cents out to pay for their infrastructure and their Department of Education, their buildings, their overhead, their lights, and ultimately only about 40 cents gets back to Appleton. It seems to me to just leave the tax dollar there in
Ridiculous.
Appleton,
Yeah.
and let those parents, that school board, find the best solution for Appleton. And that would interject a certain level of competitiveness between school districts and cities. And I think we'd actually see an improvement in education. But before that can happen, I think that we have to have the American people willing to have a thoughtful, dispassionate dialogue on what it is that we want for our children going forward. And that means we can't demagogue it, we can't be hateful in our tone, in our speech, but instead we want to have all stakeholders, families, parents, maybe even some older children, educators, administrators, and government officials engage in that dialogue to see what we can do to improve it in a more cost-efficient way. But the idea that every state has a Department of Education and a federal Department of Education, or every state has a natural resources or EPA or DNR, and then the federal government has one, there's a lot of duplication.
Totally redundant.
It's very redundant, and we could do better and be more efficient, because I trust people here in Wisconsin more than I trust people in Washington, D.C.
You know, I think, I really believe that most Americans are not even aware that that happens.
Oh, yeah.
They're not even aware that it duplicates itself over and over and over, and they're paying over and over and over for
it's
the
just
education.
layers of it.
Yeah,
just layers of it.
Just crazy.
And you know, our founders talked about enumerated powers, that what's not included in the powers that are reserved for the United States, the U.S. Constitution, should be given and kept by the states.
Right.
And if we would really rely on their original vision, I think that the federal government would be smaller.
Right.
Our states would have more robust economies, and we all might be better off.
Yeah, it's true. That's true. So can you explain to me, I hear this term all the time, quantitative easing.
Sure.
What does that term mean to you?
Quantitative easing is when the federal government, and today it's done with a click of a mouse, but decides to print money or add additional dollars into circulation throughout the U.S. economy. They might create it in the form of bonds and sell the bonds, but it's basically a monetization of debt.
That's like monopoly money.
Yeah, to a degree, it's very much like monopoly money.
Yeah.
And it can be extremely inflationary. And we're starting to see some of the inflationary impacts of quantitative easing in our commodities, because as the value of the dollar is decreased by more dollars in circulation, it creates inflation. And that's part of the problem. You see it first in commodities and hard assets like fuel, oil, food. Any type of commodity gets hit first. Now, people will say, well, yeah, but inflation is not that high, so quantitative easing isn't affecting it. And the reason it hasn't affected it in the broad economy is because there's no velocity. The money itself is not moving fast enough through the general economy, so it won't inflate yet. But when the economy picks up and the velocity of money picks up, then inflation can get very high.
I see.
Right. If they print money and just sitting in a bank someplace but not being lent out or moving, then its inflationary impact is less.
I see. So they're printing now. Are they going to print again next year?
Well, that's going to be up to the Federal Reserve, and I would hope that we can implement policies within the federal government, by the House of Representatives, by the Senate, get the President to sign it, that would restrict our spending so that they don't have to print money to cover debt.
Oh, well, let's hope so.
That's what we're working on.
Please keep working on that.
Yes, we will. Thank you.
You know, many Americans, I don't know, I guess all Americans have such a bloated sense of entitlement. We have just become entitlement, you know, addicted in this country. It's really almost like a sense of socialism that has set in America because we have so many entitlements. So what can we do to stem this tide and regain control of our economy?
Yeah, I mean, we have a societal problem.
Yes.
Certainly there, and that's part of it. And I think that what we have to do is we have to recognize that there are places where a safety net is required. That there are people that have true either physical, emotional, mental needs.
Absolutely.
And so we need to provide a safety net. Paul Ryan at the luncheon today said, well, we do need a safety net, but we have to make sure it doesn't become a hammock. That someone can sleep in it and then just live off the largesse of people.
Right.
And so our social safety net should be one in which encourages people to get out of the net rather than entrapping them in it. And that means there has to be some levels of accountability to draw people out and get them back to be productive. One of the fastest ways to get to a balanced budget in this country is to take someone who's receiving a food stamp or a unemployment check and get them a payroll check. Rather than having them taken out of the system, having them put into the system, becoming a contributor to the system. And that means we all have to work a little bit harder by incentivizing the right types of behavior and disincentivizing the wrong types of behavior, because we are a wealthy nation and we are willing to help the truly needy. So let's preserve and protect our social programs for those who truly need it.
Well, I don't know how we do that without, you know, just cutting the programs that we've got now and starting all over again.
Yeah, I think there are some things that we can do. I think there are several things we can do. If we take a look at certain programs, there are a lot of ideas out there that could help secure these programs. Things that we could do to bend the cost of healthcare down across the broad economy. And if we can get the cost of healthcare down, then Medicare costs less. And so,
well, that would be great.
Well,
if
sure.
we could get the
and there are some simple things that could be done relatively quickly. For example, we could get at liability insurance reform. You know, where medical malpractice insurance is a big part of the cost. Let's create some type of reform in the liability side of things. That's a simple thing to do.
That would be a wonderful thing to do.
Right, and let's also find ways to incentivize Americans to live healthier lifestyles, not because of a government regulation, but because it is good for them and their pocketbook.
Right.
And that means we have to move patients closer to physicians with fewer middlemen.
Yes.
And those types of things will help bend the cost curve down.
That's true. Those are very good ideas.
Right. And
excellent.
And on Social Security, we need to begin to have a dialogue with the American people on how to preserve Social Security so when my grandson, who's 7, gets there, that social safety net is there for those that need it.
Right.
And so that means we have to stop demagoguing it. You know, we have to stop using meta-scare. I've been so disappointed in the president because he says one thing at the State of the Union address and public speeches about how we need to have an adult conversation together, and then the minute Paul Ryan and the Republicans pass a budget, he right away jumps to scaring seniors.
Yeah.
And it's so disingenuous and untruthful. We want to preserve Medicare and Social Security for the next generation, not destroy it. What the president should do is participate and engage in the conversation with solutions, not with demagoguery.
Right. Well, what would make Reid Ribble feel like he had really filled his calling as a congressman?
Well,
if he could look ahead in the years and say, I feel like I really filled my calling by being a congressman and serving in the United States Congress, what would satisfy you?
I think what would satisfy me is if we have actually put the country and changed the trajectory of how we spend money towards true balance. I mean, and when I talk about balance, I'm talking about structural balance, where the government is only as large as the American people are willing to pay for. And if we could get to that place, we would secure the future prosperity of not just my children, but my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. We would send a powerful message to the future generations that this generation of Americans are not going to be selfish. You know, they talked about my father's generation who fought in World War II. They called them the greatest generation.
Right.
I wonder what they'll say about us.
Yes.
And I can imagine what that story will be, but we have to rewrite it. And we're still alive today to do that. And so when I'm done with my time in Congress, if I have helped write a page or a paragraph to make that story prosperous for our children, I will have accomplished my goal.
Very good. We have to turn the ship around.
We do.
Okay.
Thank you
Thank you
very
for
much,
coming
Sandra. It's
in.
good
It
to
was
be
a
here.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Yes. And thank you for watching today. We want your comments. It's your decision on who's right. So email us at who'sright.org and we'll see you again. Thank you for watching.